Welcome to Start Now, a conversational podcast which discusses topical issues designed to get people to think about the challenges occurring in the world around us and how each of us can be a part of positive, transformative change. Start Now is meant to be informative and engaging while encouraging and motivating people to start where they are and with the resources they have to make a difference in their communities and in the worlds around them. Let's start now. Welcome everybody to this episode of Start Now. I am your host, Armani Ray, and today on this episode, we are going to be talking about the recent events which occurred at our nation's capital and also the real versus perceived identity of America. We also will be talking about ways that everyday citizens can be a part of positive, lasting change while armed with the facts to fight against systems of injustice. But first, introductions. On today's show, we have with us Dr. Cicely Walker-Brantley. Dr. Brantley is a college educator and empowerment speaker, a certified family educator, and a licensed psychotherapist in her own private practice, CWB Psychotherapy and Empowerment LLC. We also have joining us Kim Armstrong. Kim is a marketing professional and with extensive background in community organizing and political advocacy. She has served on numerous political campaigns and is regarded for her political expertise. We also have joining us Miss Brandy Durham, JD. Brandy is a graduate of the Florida A&M University College of Law. Combined with her passion for making a difference as well as being a mother, Brandy utilizes her strong legal background serving as a community organizer and activist. She also is the owner of Durham Legal Services. And last but certainly not least, we have Mr. Mutaki Akbar. Attorney Akbar practices in the areas of criminal defense, personal injury law, and civil rights. As a managing partner of Akbar Law Firm, Mutaki is heavily involved in community and civil organizations where he serves on numerous boards. His continuous investments in his local community have contributed to its increased growth and development, and he is highly respected among community leaders and residents alike. Welcome, everybody. We are so glad that you have joined us for today's episode in this very extensive topic. All right, so we are going to jump right in. In the very first episode of Start Now, we talked about restoring the soul of the nation that has essentially really been kind of torn apart over the past 4 years under this current administration. So if you fast forward to the beginning of January, and we saw the attack on the nation's capital, and it was obviously led by the nation's leader himself. So this is the same person who has really spent the last 4 years dividing the country, based off of lies, based off of promoting hate, and then really trying to do everything possible to retain power. And this includes by breaking state, federal, and constitutional laws. When we look at the events that occurred during the latter part of 2020 and into so far the early part of 2021, many people sit in disbelief and wonder, one, why is this stuff even happening? But also, why is it allowed to continue to happen? Like, why is this happening in the first place? And so when the Capitol riots occurred, I saw so many photos of rioters in the Capitol, stealing stuff, threatening the law enforcement that were there, their violence, they're breaking in. And a lot of people were captioning these photos, "This is America." And this really bothered me because it's not America. It's not who I am. It's not who any of you are. And I'm sure it's not who your friends are. And it's certainly not what our country was founded upon, the basic principle of freedom, that when people came over here, that's what they were essentially seeking. And so when individuals from other countries come over here from, maybe they're leaving their own countries from, war, famine, civil or social unrest, that's not what America is either. These people are coming here for a better way of life. And so I really wanted our conversation to begin with, what is the identity of America? And so Kim, I'm going to start with you because I know that you were in our very first episode where we talked about restoring the soul of the nation. We know that part of the American foundation was built on the principle that we're all created equal and we all have certain fundamental rights. So can you start our conversation off by talking to us about some of these founding principles and what's still in play today from when these principles were first institutionalized or first started?
That's a huge question, but I'll start off with just sort of what I mentioned earlier to you. I think one of my favorite quotes that I saw from everything that happened was, if you're not hungry for justice, maybe it's because you're too full of privilege. And, you know, everyone talks about the huge founding ideals of this country, and sort of this country was founded as a white supremacist nation. So I think there's just a lot of reckoning that needs to be done. When people say, let's have unity and move forward, it's hard when, you know, the huge riots that happen where they want to play whataboutism and say, you know, nothing happened and you condone the violence of Black Lives Matter. Well, there was a reason that people were in the streets. You know, there needed to be a reckoning about, you know, things that have been happening for many, many years since the founding of this country. So I don't know, it's difficult to talk about how the country was founded because, you know, it was founded on a lot of white supremacy.
Yeah, and what I find interesting is that when you talk about some of the founding principles, you know, they're very basic, you know, like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of, you know, due process, you know, and when they talked about, you know, individuals, you know, being created equal and having these certain unalienable rights, you know, it was all people. It was American, you know, people who came here from Europe, you know, it was Native Americans. And we've seen so much where that just has not been true. And so it's really interesting when you look at what the founding principles were to kind of shifting to where we are now. And are these principles really true? And have they really been not really say like partaken in, but have they really been invested in almost? And so
Can
when
I,
you
can I
talk
chime
about,
in? I'm sorry.
yeah, of course.
I'm sorry. Yeah, I mean, I think we got to be honest, and like those principles were not meant for Black people. They were not meant for women.
Not
They were not meant for Native Americans. It was for white men.
Right.
So those inalienable rights that they spoke about was not meant. So the soul of this nation is like Kim was saying, is white supremacy. So we
Right.
got to start there. And then talk about healing. But we can't start with, this is not America, because it is America. It was what it was founded on when the Constitution was written. Slaves were in the backyard. So let's start there and then go, and then go from there. That's how we get healing.
Yeah, no, and it's very true, and I agree, because you've seen that it wasn't for everybody, even though they said that all men are created equal. It literally was just like that. That's literally what they meant, because, you know, over the course of the years, it was like women were fighting for rights, you know, African Americans were fighting for rights. You have all these groups of people who continuously fight for the right, you know, that these white men, you know, already had. And so when I say that it's not who America is, you know, what I mean by that is it's not who America is, you know, for us, you know, for the people who believe that America is something better and can be something better, you know, and it's one of those things that we have to work for. And I know that our conversation today is really going to carry, you know, that tone throughout it. And so when we talk about the whole idea of white supremacy, let's look at this current administration and Trump and this word Trumpism. So let's take a look at what that is. Brandy, can you explain to us a little bit about what you think, you know, Trumpism is and why it came to be?
in my opinion and from my perception, Trumpism really is just white supremacy. It just represents white supremacy. It represents the white man's desire to stay on top, the white man's desire for no other set or group of people like Black people or any you know subset within that group to become any sort of equivalent to the white man. And so like Mutaku said, yes, the Constitution did not address, it didn't even mention our name, you know, Black people, African people of African descent. It didn't even mention us, you know, explicitly, because it was really for white men. And then even amongst the white men, we know that they really meant the white men with privilege and power, not, you know, the poor white men. We don't even, you know, they're the second set of white men. But as we fast forward through time, you know, that has always been a motivator amongst white men to stay on top, because they were always on top. And so it has somehow trickled in through to the lower class, you know, if we talk about poverty, the classes, and those men thinking, you know, translating that what the Constitution meant to thinking that, you know, I'm also included because I'm a white man and nobody can be equal to me and we will not be replaced, whatever that means, in this nation. So Trumpism is, you know, Trump understood that there's a large population of people, of white people, who think like this, who think that they will somehow be replaced if Black people or Hispanic people get in positions of power. And that's why when President Obama was elected, it was such a big deal. I heard people say, you know, I'm not going to listen to a Black man. I'm not going to, you know, yes, you are. That's the president. You know, at the end of the day, he's not going to try to kill you, but they see it as, you know, as them being replaced. So Trumpism is, Trump capitalized on that mindset. He capitalized on it because he knew it existed. And so he said everything those people wanted to hear. He said, we're not going to let them run us. We're not going to let the system take over. You know, we're going to make sure we're on top. We are America. We are what America is and not them. And he capitalized on it. So Trumpism is nothing but another word for white supremacy, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that for sure. Kim, if I can move to you, I want to kind of look at the founding principles of American democracy. So some of those include popular sovereignty and limited government. So the idea that the government draws its power from people and that we have a limited government for a reason, you know, so that one person can't come in and take and have extreme power. How do you think we got to the place where we did with Trump, where he pretty much thinks that he can do whatever he wants, and the people that follow him and support him just completely think that's okay? So basically, when you talk about limited government, it's saying that the leader can only do what people allow. And so clearly he's been allowed to do so much, which that's a whole nother topic in and of itself. I could talk for hours about that. But how do you think we've gotten to the place that we have with him where he's really just kind of run rampant and his supporters are just, you know, pretty much okay with whatever's going on?
Well, I think bullying had a lot to do with it. But again, the structure of America was such that, you know, the Electoral College was made to sort of make sure that power was seated with white supremacy. So, you know, it's not, we call ourselves a democracy, but what we are is a republic where the people, you know, the way that it has been structured to make sure that only certain people's voices could be heard. You know, I'm losing the word now. Oh, gerrymandering. You know, they choose their voters instead of the voters choosing the elected person. So that has emboldened a lot of people. A lot of far right people have been elected because they don't have to worry about answering to any other person in their district because it's been so drawn that those voters, you know, want someone that supports only the far right thing. And I may have strayed from your original question, but I think it's structural. That has been like the hugest part of it. You know, it is meant to be this way, and they have seen that their power is threatened more so than it ever has been. You know, we're going to be a majority minority country in just a few years. So I think that sort of existential threat has been a large part of it. And Trump has seen the power, you know, when you don't have any shame, it's very freeing. And he's been emboldened to act that way. And other people have seen that they can as well.
Yeah. And that's what I find interesting because it's exactly what you said. You know, before we've always known that racism and injustice was a problem. Like we've always known it, you know, but it was almost like you could do certain things and say certain things, you know, and there were certain things that you couldn't do and say, you know, for public norm, you know, for fear of that shame that you would be called out. And then when this administration came in, all of that just completely flew out the window. It's like, okay, now we're going to blatantly and openly, you know, do all of these things, be racist, you know, have this injustice. And of course it was there before, but like I said, it wasn't something that people would just go out and pray about. Like, you know, it was the cool thing to do. You know, some people would, but.
And that might be a white thing. We may say that has been, that it has been a shocking change, and other people might not say. Other people may
Right.
have seen.
Right. No, you're right. And there's something that Cicely will talk on a little bit. I saw her shaking her head to what you were saying a few minutes ago about being threatened. And that's something that she's going to touch on actually. And so it provides a really great segue because Cicely, I want to use a quote when we transition into you. So a government big enough to give you everything you want is strong enough to take everything you have. And so I want to use that, and that's a quote from Thomas Jefferson, and I want to use that to move into this whole ideology of Trumpism. And do you think it's dangerous? Do you think this whole idea of, what he's promoting and putting out there is dangerous? And if so, why or why not?
It is a great segue. And so thank you, Kim, for mentioning that. But 100% yes, it is a dangerous ideology. There are many reasons, but I want to start with the fact that there are biological reactions in the human body. In our brains, we react a certain way to fear, okay? So given that much of Trump's, all the spewing that he does, so much of it has been based in fear, we all have a fight or flight response when we feel threatened or when we are in fear for our lives or for our safety or the safety of those that we love. When that happens, we are going to fight, or we're going to run or try to get to safety, or some people freeze. There are different reactions that we all have. But in the climate that we're in right now, so many people are encouraging their like-minded folks to get ready to fight. And they're basing it in all of these things that Trump is saying. Rapists, people are racist, people are coming from shithole countries. Sorry for the language, but that's what he said. All of the things that he said that get people worried about their safety, so that when they walk down the street and they see a black man coming towards them, their fight or flight reaction is engaged. So yes, it's absolutely dangerous. Science has proven it. There are studies that you can actually go and look up that show that many people who are considered far-right conservatives have a larger amygdala, which is a part of the brain that is our emotional center, and that they react much more extremely when they're viewing certain disturbing images. And those images now include people who don't look like them. So to just circle back around, the answer is a resounding yes. I believe that this Trumpist ideology is definitely dangerous. And it may even be dangerous in ways that people aren't conscious of. Some of his followers may not be conscious of the kinds of fear that they have and the ways that they'll react. But fight or flight reaction we don't react always in a conscious mind. It's instinctive. So yes.
But I think part of the problem is so much of what he's saying, I want to say if not 100% of what he's saying, is lies. It's not true. And so these people are the supporters and the individuals who feel the way that you feel and the way that, you all have been talking about this whole time. What they're believing or their value system is rooted in a system of lies. So Mutaki, if I can transition to you and get your thoughts on this, talk to us a little bit about the difference of misinformation versus disinformation, and what is the detriment in spreading lies and untruths? How does that affect a society as a whole?
Well, I mean, the two terms are very similar. Disinformation is actually a subset of misinformation. Misinformation is, telling untruths, deceiving, giving information that's untruthful and deceiving. But disinformation is with the intent to deceive, and misinformation is just wrong information. And so I think what we have with Trump, I think it's more disinformation. So the election was fraud. Like, he knew it was fraud. I mean, he knows it's not fraud. He knows that he lost. He knows that there's nothing that he could have done to overturn it. But instead, he's giving out this disinformation in order to spew the hate amongst his followers, in order to energize them to do exactly what we saw last week on January 6th. So we see that as dangerous. I mean, the disinformation is that immigrants are coming to this country to take over and to pretty much replace the white man. That's disinformation. And so again, for those white men who already feel like their jobs are being taken away from them, or they're not getting the piece of the pie that they deserve. They then turn that into hate. They then turn that into violence. So that disinformation is dangerous, and it comes from both the misinformation and the disinformation comes from nationalism, and that's what he's pushing. He's pushing white nationalism, and nationalism in and of itself is not bad. In and of itself is not bad, but when it becomes nationalism to advance, not only advance my race or to knock out other races, then that's when it becomes bad. And when I say but it's like a limited area, in my opinion, that when it's not necessarily bad. So I think it's kind of a natural thing to want to advance who you are. Every other race, every other nation do it. The Japanese, the Buddhists. Like their symbols represent themselves. Like that's a form of nationalism. They advance their businesses first, or in Asia, like that's a form of nationalism. But they don't say you need to hate this other group, or you need to dislike this other group, or keep this other group out because you look a certain way, or because you believe a certain thing. So the nationalism that Trump has been pushing it's closer to white nationalism, white supremacy that we've seen. And even if he doesn't necessarily believe it, he knows the message that he's pushing. And because he knows that message that he's pushing, that's the misinformation piece. The disinformation piece. And it is extremely dangerous. And like I said, we saw what that can do last week. So it wasn't about let's turn this election around. It was about like it was about the Confederate flag. It was about the hate that you saw in their T-shirts. It was about the white power symbols that they were throwing up in those pictures. Like it had nothing to do with the election.
Okay. And thank you for that, because that actually is a brilliant segue into the global perception. Because when you were talking about nationalism and you were talking about, how, Japan and other countries may have their symbols, but they're not spreading hate about other countries. Under the Trump rule, and Cicely mentioned it earlier, him calling other countries, derogatory names. When we look at the global perception of what other countries now think of us, Kim, talk to us a little bit about some of the things that you've been hearing, because in agreement when we're talking, you don't go out there and degrade other countries and say other countries are lesser than you. So talk to us a little bit about some of what you've been hearing, that other countries, may, what they think their perception of America now is.
Well, Trump was always going around saying that people were laughing at us, that Obama went on an apology tour and the other countries were laughing at us. Now they really are. And we've seen, video evidence of it. But it's also doing more lasting damage, because we have lost a lot of our reputation, and we have lost our standing to go to other countries and say things about human rights and things about what's proper for rule of law and a stable democracy. We don't have that anymore, and we don't have the legitimacy to make those arguments in a lot of cases where people would look to us as the authority for that kind of thing. So we've lost our reputation globally, but also just people trusting in us to lead the world. We have let other people step into that place. When he said that he had this policy of America first, what that meant was really Trump first, but it meant that the thing that has kept world peace for so long, were our allies, and all of us sharing a common set of goals and trying to further that in the world. And we just don't have the legitimacy to do that anymore, much less the trust. Other countries, if we think that they're going to give us their top level intelligence about things that Russia is doing, I don't think so. And I don't think that we can be trusted, and we're going to have to do a lot of work to earn that trust. And even when we do, it's not going to be immediate, because they're not going to trust that in 4 years people aren't going to elect someone like Trump. So we have just a lot of work to do on this country to get our reputation back.
And can I say something
Right.
to that point as well?
Well, actually, I'm moving right into because I wanted to get your thoughts on it. Based off of what the points Mutaki was making and the points that Kim was making, what are your thoughts on, should we even be able to identify a nation based off of, people's perceptions? So please go ahead.
Oh, well, I find it interesting. 2018 was in England, and I just remember at that time, maybe a week before I went, it was when they were flying this big old baby Trump balloon around London. And then when I was there for a few weeks, I'd meet people and they'd be like, what are y'all doing? And I mean, they were saying, what were you guys doing? What were you thinking? He's messing us all up. That's what they tell me. And I'm like,
I love the accent.
I know, but that was how it was. That was just how dramatic it was. He's messing us all up. They were doing like that and everything. And I'm like, I understand. I did not vote for him though, but you don't understand. I didn't vote for him. You see
right.
the country, if you understood how our system works, because he lost the popular vote. But regardless, I have family in Canada and they're looking down at us like, what is happening in America? I have friends in Italy, Africa, and the same thing. And so it's so embarrassing to me, because America is supposed to be the place where you want to get to, like, to know so many people from other countries. So depending on the country, France may be the end goal for your family. You got to get to France. You got to get to America, because that's how you know you're going to make it in life, if you get to America. Yeah. But not so much now, and it's important because our country plays such a great role in, like, the United Nations and all these treaties that we have, these international treaties that we have. That's also part of my background. We don't have to talk about it. But we play such a large role as leaders within those treaties and within those, when we have those meetings with those nations. So, where do we stand? Will they roll their eyes at us when we try to, prosecute somebody in Africa for doing something that we probably just did within the past 4 years as well? So I just wanted to touch on that.
And it's interesting because you were overseas in 2018. I was overseas in 2019. So fast forward a year ahead from when you were there, same exact thing. Obviously our accents give us away, and they're like, oh, you're American. And they literally would be like, what is going on in your country? Who is this guy? I'd be like, I would do the same thing, Brady. I'd be like, no, I didn't vote for him. He's a fool. And so you really would try to explain the unexplainable to, individuals from other countries when they ask about what's going on, because it's true. It's just like Kim said, people saw us as a leader. Our reputation was this is one of the greatest countries, and now we're just like being laughed at. Even my professor, over at the University of Oxford, like, we would have conversations and she would really be trying to understand our government, because one of the things we were talking about was the European Union. And it's like, look, I don't even know what to tell you at this point, so you can't really have these conversations when what's going on doesn't make sense in the first place, So I think you're exactly right with what you were saying. If we look at the idea of patriotism, so if we kind of go down a little bit from nationalism to patriotism, just kind of take a step back. We look at Article 5, Section 4 of the Constitution, and so it guarantees that every state has a Republican form of government and that they shall be protected from invasion and domestic violence. So when you look at the idea of patriotism and the quality of being patriotic and, what that means, so having a devotion to one's country, none of what happened at the Capitol can really be classified as patriotic if you really want to look at it, because they had a complete disregard for the country's constitutional values. There was a complete disregard, for laws and the rule of law. You just walk in places and steal stuff. I mean, it's not patriotic, obviously, to attempt to overthrow your government and impede, them trying to complete their sworn duties. And so furthermore, it's not even conducive to prosperity, growth, and national security to act like we don't need to cooperate with other governments, so even global governments. And so Kim and Brandy, since you both, touched on this in regard, and then Mutaki too, obviously through your discussion of nationalism, talk to us a little bit about the detriment of when people act under a false sense of patriotism and nationalism and how it negatively impacts us. So they're out here literally, acting like they're being patriotic and acting like they're standing up for their country, when really what you're doing is causing a huge detriment to both aspects. So Kim, if we can start with you, and then if at any point in time, if Brandy Mutaki you want to join in, definitely by all means.
Well, I think that was one of the most strategic things that Trump did, and I'm not sure that I attribute it to his own planning and strategic, because I don't think he's smart at all. But I think giving the mainstream media, giving his followers the permission to just dismiss the mainstream media was one of the smartest things that he did, because these people are living on Earth too. They have alternative facts. And so but when you say they're living on Earth too, they're not living on the main Earth. They're living on a second Earth, right? Yeah, they have a completely and totally, they're operating in a different reality, and it's literal. Okay. Yeah, they're completely siloed off from mainstream media information. So what they felt they were doing was very patriotic. And I think one of the things that the GOP has been doing, even prior to Trump, was just making an enemy out of Democrats rather than arguing against what policies would do better, whether their policies would do better for America or Democrats' policies. They just demonized Democrats and said they want to destroy America. And that's what you hear a lot of those people say, is that, and Trump even said that, either you fight right now or you don't have a country anymore. So they're not saying we don't like their policies. They're saying they are going to destroy America. And so that has just taken our politics to a level that just, you can't have discourse.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to with what Cicely was saying about, that mindset and the science behind it. That means it's real. They have a legitimate fear of whatever the fear is that somebody put into them. So when you're dealing with people like this, like, I can guarantee you they haven't read the Constitution. I can guarantee you if they read the Constitution, they probably didn't understand it. Thank God I went to law school, right? And had to take constitutional law to have to study the Constitution, but everybody doesn't do that. And so even if they did, like I said, they probably didn't understand exactly what it meant if they've read it. So they don't even know what they mean by patriotism. They don't know what it means. They just know that they're fighting for some cause that it is not based in fact. If you were to fight, if they were to get through to those Congress people, what would they have done, the true damage, and what would it have solved? They don't have a real problem that they're actually fighting for, but they don't perceive it as so. So, loving your country, I love this country. This is where I'm from, and I know the history of slavery, but I love the United States of America. It's hard to say it sometimes, and it's hard to feel it, but this is my country. I am American. And I think that is the base of patriotism, to love your country. Where do we go from, loving one's country to killing each other in the country in the name of patriotism? It's not patriotism. I'll stop there because it's so so deep.
and again, like, I think we're coming from a place of, like, sane people, right? Like, we're coming from a place of like idealism. And they're coming from a place, when I say they are, those people who are that went into the Capitol, or like-minded individuals that went into the Capitol. So they think differently, so their realism, like what's realistic to them, makes it as if what happened was patriotic. And it makes it as what happened was patriotic because the America that they love is white, male, ruled, is like, it's a classism type, not even classism, because we know like it's up and down the class as far as people who went into the Capitol, but it's like it's white male rule. So for them, hierarchy, they need to save that identity. Like, that's the identity of America for them. So they need to save that identity. And what Trump has been doing is saying, like, your identity is at stake. Your identity is at risk. So let's save it. And so that's what they're doing. And so for them, only Trump can help them save that identity. Because Biden wants to unite. So no, like uniting is not going to save that identity. Kamala Harris doesn't look like who should be the vice president of the United States of America. So that's taken away from that identity. Marching, Black Lives Matter, like all of those things, that's not the identity of America. So we need to save the identity. So for them, they're being patriotic by saving that identity. So that's why I say, like, we have to start there. Like, we can't come in with these like rose colored glasses saying that this is not America, and America is for everybody and we're all equal. Because it hasn't been the identity. It's been hypocrisy from day one. Like when they 4th of July, it went from we're being free from the English rule to we're going to enslave people. Look, like they had slaves at the same time. So we need to change the identity of America. And that's what the cry was for this past summer. Like the cry this past summer was like, this is like, let's change the identity. So, so then it goes back to your last question, like, is it fair that this group becomes like the identity of America? Like that, it's what it's always been. Like we've been fighting, in different stages over and over again to try to change that identity.
Yeah, and it's really hard. Anybody who knows me for real knows I'm just a very idealistic person. So when Mutaki talked about idealism, I thought it was funny because I'm like, can't we all just get along? I don't understand why we still have this issue. Civil rights, we had the Civil War, and then we had the Civil Rights Movement, and then we have Black Lives Matter movement. And I'm like, why in the whole hell, excuse my language, are we still fighting for this? Why are people still fighting for these equal rights? And it's even like Mutaki was talking about a few moments ago where he said, it's men have these power, men have these rights. I have always found it so asinine, females who support Trump, because it's like at no point in time does he have your best interest in mind. Like everything that he's been saying, doing is so derogatory. And so it's like there's so many different groups that I don't understand why they would support Trump, and so when you were talking about the idea of patriotism and people being patriotic and they're, exhibiting their form, what they think, patriotism is or being patriotic is. And then when Brandy was talking about the Constitution and how, they've not even read the Constitution. And again, it's just asinine. It's like unfathomable. I don't understand. How do you fight for something when, one, you don't even know the real definition of it, and then two, you think you're defending a constitution that you really know nothing about? So it's everything. The whole premise is operating from a very basic system of ignorance. And Cicely, I feel like our guests are giving you so many nuggets for when you actually go into your part of it a little bit later, because we're talking about fears, we're talking about feeling threatened, we're talking about, the identity, being lost. And so it's almost like, when you talk about, who is American, what is America's identity, it's almost like it's in this crisis, because it's supposed to be this one thing. It's supposed to be a place where, people come seeking a better life and, everybody's equal and everybody has fair access to stuff, but they don't. And they haven't, since almost the beginning of time. So I want to take that and I want to kind of shift into, because Mutaki, once again, you're brilliant, offered a great segue, because we've been talking about Trumpism, what that means, and it's really white supremacy at its core. And a lot of it functions off of racism and fear and, white men losing what their perceived power, right? And so let's look a little bit at racism. And Mutaki, talk to us a little bit about the whole Black Lives Matter movement when it came into, and you're talking about how they were fighting about it over the summer. Tell us what it is, because there are some people out there who still don't know why individuals were fighting, what they were marching for, what they wanted, what their signs meant. When people said, I can't breathe, talk to us a little bit about what that means so people really have a clear understanding about what that movement was.
So the Black Lives Matter movement like really started, I believe it was like after the Trayvon Martin situation. And So I remember it because it was a lot of different small groups that came out of that. So it was like the Black Lives Matter, which is a group, and it's a group and it's also an idea. And so some people do not like the group, but agree with the idea. And some people go with both. You know, you had the Dream Defenders, you had like different groups, but the Black Lives Matter group kind of like sustained itself because the idea of Black Lives Matter was attached to the group pretty much. But but the idea of Black Lives Matter was pretty much to say like, look, like we deserve to live. We deserve to not have our neck stepped on by a police officer. We deserve to be able to walk in a neighborhood and not be profiled by a vigilante like neighborhood guy and shoot us because we got Skittles and a soda. We deserve to be able to sit in the park as an 11-year-old or a 12-year-old with a toy gun and not get shot on sight by law enforcement. We deserve to have mental health issues and that not be a death sentence. We deserve to be able to sleep in our own bed and not have our door knocked down by law enforcement and get killed. We deserve to, to walk out of a store after buying a single cigarette and not get killed. Like all of those things were like different issues that that we saw time after time and time after time over these last, 12, 15, about 12 years or so. But these are just like the pinnacle of what our experience has been as Black people in America since we landed in America. And so it's like you said, like it was like free us from slavery. It was give us equal rights during the civil rights movement. It was like we don't need to be sharecroppers. And now it's let us just basically live, as human beings. And so that, it kind of like blew up. I don't want to say blew up, but like so it became the big deal over this summer. And like a lot of people, and I'm sure Dr. Brantley would be able to kind of give ideas of psychologically like why it became such a big deal. Was it, everybody was home during the pandemic, so we can all go out and march? Was it just the frustration of the pandemic that kind of made everybody just kind of pay attention to it? But like, it's really just saying like, look, we want to live as human beings. And it shouldn't be that much to ask. It shouldn't be that, somebody look at what happened to George Floyd and then come back and say like, well, why are they so angry? Why are they so upset? Why are they taking it to the streets? Because you didn't hear us, when Trayvon Martin passed away and you let George Zimmerman get away with it. You didn't hear us, when Tamir Rice was murdered by a law enforcement officer and there was no accountability by law enforcement when we just said, hey, that's wrong. Can y'all do better? You didn't hear us, when Eric Garner, you didn't hear us with Michael Brown. So now we got to be louder with it. Now we might have to light a fire. Now we might have to, push some monuments down and say that we're tired of all of that. Like, because you didn't hear us. You didn't even hear us, 30 years ago when Rodney King was battered and was beat down and those riots took place. But y'all, you still didn't hear us, So now we're trying to make sure that it sticks. Now we're trying to make sure that you really hear us. So it's not just about the marching though. So now we're pushing policies. Now we're, the idea of defund the police. Yeah, I mean, maybe like the wording of it kind of turns people off, but like the idea is we need to change the policies because it's really the policies that's in place that's allowing these things to happen.
Okay. So much like I'm just thinking everything that you said. And when you look at the Black Lives Matter movement and you were saying that you just want to live. It's such a basic fundamental thing. It's kind of like when you look at basic fundamental rights and Kim, I think it's either Kim or Brandy mentioned it earlier when you were talking about the universal human rights, that actually is a thing. And it is, things simple as, access to healthcare, to education, and so it's so crazy to think that you have to march just to live. What has been the difference that you've seen from the civil rights movement that occurred in the 50s and 60s to the Black Lives Matter. So if you fast forward 65 years, have you seen any difference, and do you feel like any progress has been made, Mutaki, from what you were saying?
Any progress has been made as far as what? What do you mean?
From the civil rights movement, everything that happened in civil rights movement, everything that, you know, the individuals were marching for, you know, and you had, you know, mixed groups of individuals that were marching for African Americans, you know, again, basic civil rights. Have you seen progress, or what have you seen out in the community or in the nation? You know, do you see any similarities or comparisons from the civil rights movement to the Black Lives Matter movement? Like, what do you feel like has changed in 65 years?
I mean, obviously there's been progress, you know, like, so we could go in restaurants, we can go, you know, like we can like live equally, so to speak. I think what was not deconstructed after the civil rights movement was white supremacy. Was, you know, so when I say that wasn't deconstructed, like we're still being taught from like kind of a Eurocentric standpoint, like in our educational system. There's still economic inequalities that's just like embedded in the system. There's so much that's still that, so it's the same exact system, but it looks different. And it operates different. And so we kind of got psyched into thinking that we made it, you know, after the civil rights movement, and even more so during the Obama administration. Like we really was like, okay, we're post-racial, we made it, we don't have to worry about any of this stuff. And so I believe that, and you know, and Trayvon was killed during the Obama administration. You know, and a lot of these murders happened, like the Black Lives Matter movement was during the Obama administration. And so, but still we're thinking, but we have Obama in office, like we made it, you know, but that electing Obama didn't deconstruct, you know, the system that's been in place. And so yes, progress has been made. I think the similarities are that we're fighting, marching, asking, pushing for equality. But I think what we're seeing now is that, hey, we got to dig deeper and deconstruct the system that's in place.
Can I say something to that point real quick?
Oh, of course. Yeah.
I totally agree I think that, you know, after the civil rights, it seemed like concessions, like, okay, we're just going to shut y'all up real quick and give you what you ask for and keep it moving. When the real issue is not Black people asking for things. The real issue is the system, right? Like what Mutaki said. So it's kind of like when if a building falls down, there's a lot of dust and, you know, rubble and just a lot of stuff in the air. You got to kind of wait for it to all settle before you can see, okay, what happened? What made the building fall? If something caught on fire, you got to let it stop and die down to see what, you know, what was the root cause of everything. And I think that when the civil rights movement, we got our rights to vote and everything, when everything settled down, we could really see, oh, actually, no, this is actually what the problem is. And so, you know, I think we were kind of content for a long time. I don't like to call Black Lives Matter a movement, because it really is. It's a thing. It's a statement, and it's a fact. Black lives do matter, and people are calling it a movement. Like, you know, once something happens, the movement's going to be over with, and it's not, because my life does matter. But it's not until what Mutaki said. When that happens, when we start to hit the root cause of everything, the white supremacy, the systemic oppression, and everything that you know, this nation was you know, the foundation of this nation. Until that is crumbled and rebuilt, then we're not going to stop. So I just wanted to touch on that.
No, it's great that you did, because it actually moves us into our next topic, because you and Mutaki both were talking about deconstructed systems and systems of oppression. And it actually shifts very nicely into what I wanted to have Cicely talk about. So I love to read. I actually read more than I watch TV. I know I was joking with you all, you know, before we, you know, got on our call and everything about, I really don't know too much about what's going on TV. But I like to read. And so I wanted to share with you all a quote from a philosopher that says, man is pushed by drives, but pulled by values. And it's these values and inner awareness that prevent us from being puppets. So Cicely, I want to take that and everything that Brandy and Mutaki and Kim have been saying, and talk a little bit about these ideologies and these systems and ask, why do they persist and can they ever be stopped?
Good question.
I know I just gave you a great question.
Yeah. So why do they persist? That is connected to some of the things, obviously, we've all been talking about, kind of this reactive movement, or these reactive statements that have been made, and how Trump has tapped into something that has caused people to feel like they need to protect themselves. All of that comes together to, and then it results in these kinds of ideologies that for some people at their core, I believe some of these Trump supporters really believe this is what they have to do to protect themselves. It's not just, I'm going to go along with it. I think they really believe the country has been stolen. We have to save the country, so perception is reality. I'm sure we've all heard that phrase, but it really is true. If I perceive that I am in danger, that my well-being, that resources are limited because whoever they may be in that moment, right? Because they are taking the resources, because they are trying to take over. If I believe that, then I am going to act in a way that lines up with that belief. And that's what we see a lot of people doing. They're lining up with these racist and sexist and, xenophobic belief systems because they actually believe what's being spewed from the top. So these ideologies will continue to persist as long as they are allowed to be voiced, as long as people with power are not standing up loudly and clearly saying we have zero tolerance for that. So the question of can they ever be stopped? I mean, theoretically, yes. Theoretically, they can be stopped. Now, practically, listen, one person at a time. One person at a time is the only way that we can see people begin to have their eyes open and to realize I've been drinking the Kool-Aid. I'm going to now stop drinking that Kool-Aid and realize that this unity that we talk about does not happen when there's an us versus them mentality. I got to get rid of the us versus them mentality and realize that we are all in this together. And that if I want to believe that all lives matter, which was reactive, which really isn't a thing, right? People only began to say that because Black Lives Matter was a genuine response to Black lives being treated like they did not matter. All lives matter was just, what do you mean Black lives matter? All lives matter. So it was a silencing tactic. It was not a movement. All lives matter. So having said that, if someone believes that all lives matter, then there will be no us versus them mentality. And that is how the ideologies begin to be deconstructed, as Mutaki mentioned.
I don't want to throw you on the spot, but when you and I were talking previously, you shared what I thought was a great way to get people to understand the sense of privilege that they have. And it's a method that you use with your students at the university. So can you share a little bit about that, where you're talking about able-bodied privilege versus, white privilege versus this privilege?
Sure. One of the things that happens when you go straight towards a person who is operating in these racist ideologies and you say that's racist, then immediately their defenses go up and they're probably not going to hear anything else that you say after that. However, if you do something that I like to call backdoor into the conversation, they are more likely to see where you're coming from. When I teach on white privilege, it is rare that I just start talking about white people have privilege, because my classes most of them are either 60-40 or even more. There are more white students than there are Black, and I don't want to see faces glaze over and eyes roll. I want students to engage. I want them to listen. So I often start the conversation by talking about, like you mentioned, able-bodied privilege. I talk about something like, how many of you have to think about whether or not there is a wheelchair ramp when you walk into a store? Typically, none of my students, there have been a couple classes where I have some students who have physical disabilities, but most sit there and they go, no. How many of you have to think about whether or not there's a working elevator? How many, if there are enough parking spots open for you to be able to get to where you need to go without a lot of difficulty? It's really rare that I have students to raise their hand. And then I take that and I move to things like, if you're looking for shoes or something and you see neutral, how many of you have to wonder, does neutral, is that going to match my skin color or is it just going to match another skin color? So I talk about those things, and I've got students agreeing and they're understanding, what does it mean to have home field advantage for a team? You know, so I'm getting closer and closer to what privilege actually is. So by this time, I've got lots of buy-in. And then I can say, so that home team advantage in the United States of America, who is said to have home team advantage? It's quiet for a minute. And then I'll have a few students that say, well, white people, you know, white men, historically, white people are the norm. They are those who are seen as a home team. And that's how the conversation actually takes off, and people are able to begin to have their eyes open and say, oh, that's what it means to have privilege. It's not just about life is easier for me. It's really more about, if life is hard, it's not because of the color of my skin. There's another reason. If life is hard for me, it's not, I can say for sure, it's not because of what I look like. So yeah, that's kind of how I do it in most of my classes. And I do end up with more buy-in than when I've tried it in other ways.
And thank you for sharing that, because I really feel like it ties home with what we've been talking about this whole time. You know, when Kim first started talking about the ideas of, white supremacy, and that's pretty much what has been, from the inception. And so I think that's just such a brilliant way, because again, as soon as you go to somebody and you say, oh, you have privilege, like it automatically, their defenses are up, just as you were saying, and and nobody wants to listen, and so when we were talking before, just all of us offline, we were saying, how do you really end this? Can it really be ended? And yeah, I agree that it can. I feel like it's just like, poverty, it's a man-made problem, racism, man-made problem, like it could completely be ended. But it's baby steps. It's starting with that one person. It's, using your, kind of back into it method, so people, don't have their defenses up automatically and feel so threatened and have that fear. And I want to kind of use that to transition into our comparison and contrast of the events that have occurred, because the individuals that took place in the Capitol riots, like they genuinely feel their actions were justified. Like they genuinely feel what they did was okay. And so when we look at the, obviously all the protests that occurred over the summer during the Black Lives Matter, and then you look at the Capitol riots, let's look at a little compare and contrast. So Brandy, let's talk about some of the actions. What have you seen were some of the differences in the actions of the protesters from the Black Lives Matter protests to the Capitol riot protests?
So as you know, I am a staunch protester. I partake in a lot of protests for not just Black rights, for LGBTQ rights as well.
And we both did the women's rights, but in different cities. You were doing it in Orlando when I was doing it in Tallahassee.
I will, me and Donna, I take my child since he was a baby in a stroller, and we are marching. We're going to go march today, son. So, the difference is that when I know that I'm going to a protest that pertains to Black people's rights, and I know that to be wary, I am always on alert, because I expect there to be a high presence, a large presence of law enforcement. I expect there to be opposition from All Lives Matter, Blue Lives Matter supporters. So I expect there to be, I expect the government to have prepared very well for our presence in that march. Then you get to hear what happened on January 6th. And from what I'm seeing, I don't see what I see, on the TV. I didn't see what I see in person. Last summer, I was marching last summer in the middle of COVID. I had on the mask, the shield and everything. I told my son, we got to shield up and everything, because this is important. So I didn't see what I was used to seeing. And I cried, and I'll try not to get emotional here, because I do involve my child in these events, because I think it's important for our children to understand, where we stand in this nation in regard to the systems that we are, that we have to live through. And so, I'm always on alert because I want to make sure his life is safe and that he doesn't get harmed when, a law enforcement officer feels he's threatened by Black people's presence, So for me to see all of those people in the Capitol, to see a man walking through the Capitol with the Confederate flag and to know what that flag stands for, what it means for people, what it meant at the time that it was created and what it still means, yet to see so little presence of law enforcement, so little preparation by the city. They didn't call in the National Guard, they didn't call in any other law enforcement from any other city as backup, reinforcements, to see the difference in how they prepared for their presence just made me so emotional. And I was physically sick and physically upset because it not only shows that the people who were protesting and who partook in those dangerous activities by storming the Capitol, they understood that they were not going to be harmed the way Black people are harmed. And then it also goes to show that the people in power understand, are on some same level of understanding that they are not perceived as dangerous as Black people. So it really, like Mutaki said, it just lets you know that the root of the cause is the system. It's what's written in the Constitution. The root of the issue is white supremacy. Why are white people who, they have evidence, the FBI had evidence that people were planning on taking firearms. They placed bombs around the nation's capital. They had nooses, they had been preparing, they made t-shirts, Mike Pence killed this person, they actually planned to do harm on people, and there was evidence of it, and nobody prepared to counteract anything that was planned. But if Black people plan to march in the city and scream, "We shall overcome," or, "Stop killing us, we can't breathe," and we plan to just bring awareness with no weapons. We don't want to cause any harm to anybody. We are met with such resistance. We are met with all the shields, all the helmets, the big guns, So just the difference. It just makes me so emotional. I'm infuriated because I have been participating in these types of things since, I was as a teenager. So I see how the cities prepare. So the biggest slap in the face as an American citizen, participating or partaking in my First Amendment right. But knowing that, in doing so, I could still be shot just because somebody thinks that I'm a danger to them, versus purposefully planning to hurt people. It shocked me, and I was very upset, and I was very hurt by their response to those people coming into Washington, D.C.
Yeah, and I mean, but your emotions are justified and valid, and it is shocking because, whereas the Black Lives Matter marches and protests took place during the course of months, and for the most part, they were peaceful marches, literally the street. A lot of them happened here. I know they happened where you all are as well. And they were just peaceful, individuals marching in the streets, with their signs, their life matters. They just want to live. They just want to breathe. And the Capitol riot was the course of one day, and it was violent, and individuals, broke in, committed these laws. There was a story on the news. One of the individuals who was former military went in with zip ties because he deliberately plans on, taking hostages, kidnapping people or whatever. And it's really interesting because you will see online, when you're following these events, that the lawmakers, majority of them white, that were in that room, were saying, now you all know what a no-knock warrant is, because you see them hiding behind their seats, hiding behind desks, hiding behind, the rows of pews and stuff like that. I don't know if they're called pews in the Capitol, but whatever, I'm gonna call them that. But the point is, they are literally ducking and hiding and scared for their life but when you walk in, in the instance of Breonna Taylor, and just bust in and shoot somebody in their own home, nobody says too much, or when people do say too much, now all of a sudden it's a problem. And so I want to take everything that you said, Brandy, and transition it into Mutaki and look at some of the punishments. So what have you seen in the variants of punishments from the Black Lives Matter protesters who were arrested to the individuals that are arrested at the Capitol for their crimes?
Well, it's kind of early as far as like the punishments goes. I mean, I guess like from this summer to now for the Black Lives Matter movement, those people who were arrested, I can speak on here locally. I guess like the bulk of the arrests have been like for minor arrests, like trespassing. There was a big group, the Tally 19, for those who haven't heard of that. That was a group that were confronted by like riot gear, police officers after a minor traffic stop. It just turned into this huge deal. Maybe like one or two people got a felony, and then the rest were also for misdemeanors, like resisting arrest without violence. Was the bulk of it. Like they were offered what they call a diversion program, which is like community service, take a class, the charges get dropped. The guys at the Capitol, not the guys, these vigilantes at the Capitol, they were federally charged. So I will be interested in seeing what ultimately happens with them. Most of them have felonies on them, and I think it's going to end up being like a much bigger deal as far as the response to that. But I think like one thing that's interesting that people really not talking about is that, like, for the Tally 19, I represent probably about 12 of them, and the majority of them are white. And before that, it was about 2 or 3 arrests from like other protests earlier in the summer, and I represent probably about the only 2 or 3 people that got arrested even then here in Tallahassee, and they were all white. So it's not necessarily the color, but it's the message. That's what the fear is. Like, so they'll arrest a white person if you screaming for Black lives. Like they don't care what color you are, because they're challenging the system. That's the fear. The fear is I don't care who's challenging it. Like if you challenging this system, that's in the part of challenging that system is screaming for Black lives, then you're going to face, then you're a bigger threat than those people who showed up at the Capitol with guns and bombs and zip ties and everything else. You're a bigger threat because you're not screaming for Black folks. You're not screaming to deconstruct the system that's been in place for so long. So again, so the reaction, of course, is different, and I think the reaction is different because of what we're fighting for, what they're fighting for.
Okay, I'm going to take that and use that to transition into the progress of how do we move forward from here. Because obviously, we talked about the different, Brandy touched on the reaction of law enforcement, how they were out in full effect when it was the Black Lives Matter marches and protests, but then they were like crickets, when it came to the Capitol riot, even though, you had warnings and you knew in advance of what was going on. And we talked about the escalation of how, one occurred over the course of months and one was one day, and it just went from point A to point Z in like 2 seconds. So when we talk about America and America's identity and wanting America to be great and wanting America to regain its sense of strength and a reputation, we look at progress. And so I know that we were talking about you can't have unity until you really address these systems that have put all of this injustice and violence in place to begin with. You can't jump from point A to point D. You got to start at the beginning. So talking about, Mutaki mentioned the fear of the system itself. Cicely, talk to us a little bit about the behavioral aspects and components. How do we impact change on a behavioral standpoint, the very basic level of human behavior, thought, fear, and emotion? How do you impact change there?
Well, again, another kind of really important question. It starts with conversation. Some of you may have seen there's an image. It's a poster that's up in a lot of teacher classrooms, and you can find a meme online. But it talks about how thoughts become words, words become actions, actions become habits, so on and so forth. So to change someone's behaviors, you really do have to go back and try to have the kind of conversation that will change the way that they think. That's not a small task. I want to make sure that I'm clear on that. But that's really what it takes to break down some of the really hardwired, racist, elitist ideas that some of these people have. It's not a small charge, but those of us who are trying to make that difference have to be willing to kind of take all those emotions that we have, contain them as much as we can while we have conversations with people that do help them to see their own behaviors from another perspective, that do help them to see my experiences and someone else's, another person of color, an LGBTQ person, helps them to see the other experiences in such a way that they can relate. They have to be able to relate to someone else's experiences, to someone else's pain, and to realize this idea of a threat is just that, it's an idea, it's not real. And when you can have those kinds of conversations, then that origin of the not so much the origin, but what prompts our behaviors, those thinking patterns, those begin to shift. And when the thinking patterns begin to shift, the behaviors will begin to shift as well. But it does take some real kind of self-control on the part of folks who know better and who are already doing better. It takes a lot more control on their part to have the conversations, to start the changing, like I said, on the thought level. And that, I don't know that that's a direct answer. It doesn't give, Armani, I know you were mentioning action steps. It is the conversations. It's having groups that sit down together. And, I've seen some of it in the media where they have some of the groups sit down and talk about why you believe this way. Is this really what's happening? Kind of challenge this idea that what you think, does it really match what you're experiencing? Those kinds of conversations and discussions can really help. But it really does start on that very basic level of talking about it and changing the thinking.
Okay, thank you. Mutaki, I want to jump over to you real quick and talk about the influence. So individuals who are out there protesting, marching, who are speaking up, using their voice, in any resources that they have, on any platform they have to be a part of that change that Cicely was talking about. Let's talk just briefly about influence, people who see problems and don't do anything. So I want to use a quote from Dr. Martin Luther King that says, "Our lives begin to end the day we become silent about the things that matter." Is there harm done by people who see this and do nothing? If so, what is that? And how can people really be empowered to step up and be a part of the change, without, having that fear?
Honestly, I don't think that everybody have to play a role in this, to be honest with you. I don't see, like some people can see it, they can feel it, they can internalize it, but that doesn't mean that they have to get out on the, I don't say in the front lines or even the back lines, but I think as simple as acknowledging it is enough. But I don't necessarily think that, they have to join the march or go get some policy changes or anything like that. I just think we have to be realistic and say it's just not everybody's fight, I empathize and sympathize with the LGBTQ community, but I don't necessarily do anything outwardly to fight for their causes. Does that mean that I don't believe in it? No. But so that's just a small example. So, and I know that might not be a popular opinion of it, but I do think ignoring it, doing the opposite, ignoring it, dismissing it, saying that it's not an issue, saying that it's not a problem, I think that's a problem. But I don't necessarily think if you're not out there doing something, then there's something wrong with that.
Okay. And that's a very valid point.
Can I real quick just say, to piggyback a little bit on that, I think you're absolutely right. Not everybody has to march, but I think everybody can. If you're in the presence of a child, for instance, that says, "Oh, that's a Black person," rather than going, "We don't talk about, let's not." You just say, their skin is different. Our skin is this color, yours, and we're all different. And you notice that difference. You know what I mean? Research has shown that when we hush things, that actually makes it a more difficult topic, and it teaches our children there's something wrong with that difference.
Yeah.
When we address it, in whatever space that we have, with whatever people that we can reach, that begins to make change. So you're right, Mutaki. We don't know how to be marching, but we all have opportunities to make some kind of change, one person at a time.
That's
right. Yeah. And sometimes even it takes the smallest step, even if you're addressing it within your home, because that's moving us into our, final topic of this episode is, being able to support change, and so even if it's something as simple as supporting it in your own home. And Brandy, I know you have a young son, so it starts in the home. And I was talking to Cicely before that it's crazy how these cycles perpetuate, and they're vicious cycles. If you have parents who believe this way, they teach the kids, and the kids grow up and they still have these instilled values, and then they go on and they teach their kids, and so it's cycles that have to be broken. And so in wrapping up, Brandy and Kim, talk to us a little bit more about some other changes that you feel individuals could make, whether it's on a school level. And Dr. Cicely, you can jump in too, obviously being a college educator. What are some changes that people can make on a school level? Mutaki, you can jump in also being a business owner and businesses. Just talk to us briefly about some quick action steps that people can take to be a part of change within their community so these cycles don't continue. Kim, do you want to start first?
Sure.
Sorry.
I think there just needs to be a lot of education. A lot of it probably does need to start in schools, and I don't know if there's even the capacity to do that, but the Texas school board sort of decides the school board, because they buy so many, they decide the content for a lot of the school books. So they have taken out a lot of education. I think just a lot of people need to understand that the government has played a part and white supremacist, this systemic racism. There just needs to be a lot more education about that. It almost needs to be like a cult deprogramming, from what Trump has been. But you just have to sort of meet people where their values are. You don't need to bring a big policy discussion into it. You just possibly start small. I love a lot of what Dr. Cicely had to say about that. But, just anyway, we need to have a lot more conversations. I don't know. It's such a huge problem to tackle.
Yeah, I'm all about spreading love, right? It's so idealistic, and I'm,
I know it's hard to be an idealist because
I say, it's just, I have one of my best friends, growing up, and she's white, and growing up, like, she wear Confederate flag stuff, and I'd roll my eyes at her, and I mean, we were young, and she'd say, oh, there's nothing wrong with it. Yeah, it doesn't mean anything. But today, she has lost family members. She lost friends because she recognized at some point in time, oh, it actually does mean something bad, So I don't know what it was about it. I know that she, for her, a long time didn't even talk to her mom because her mom she's a big Trump supporter, So I mean, this is someone who was raised on this. So I genuinely believe, though, that by us loving each other as friends, and something was able to click. Just she recognized that life was different for me, though, growing up. So, just love on people and show people who you are so that they can kind of open their eyes to see that your American experience actually is different from theirs. She would never wear a Confederate flag shirt or bathing suit today like she used to in middle school, So I can only attribute that to the fact that we are such close friends, and our friendship. And her friendship with other Black people was able to open her eyes. I never had to tell her, you do. I never had to say anything, and it happened on her own. And even when she wasn't raised in that environment, so it's just an interesting thing. Just love. I don't know. Spread love on people. Let them see you and see your experience for what it is.
Mutaki?
I think it's providing the space to have those conversations, both ways. I like to like go to like people who might be conservative and just say, hey, like what's going on here, and listening, like truly listening, and also like giving them the space to tell me how they feel, and also like vice versa, I have the space to tell them how I feel as well. So I think it's providing that space, and being open to change.
Okay. Dr. Cicely, what about you?
I agree with that, providing the space. And I think within the spaces that we operate, as someone who teaches in a classroom full of students, one of the things I try to be mindful of the language that I'm using at all times. You know, sometimes we speak in a way that only our perspective is the one that matters, or that's the only one that's right. And I think being clear to say things like, this is my experience, what is yours? I think it's important to say things like, while some of you may see this as a norm, keep in mind others have never experienced what you've gone through. So let's listen to some of them. And sometimes privileging the voices that have often been silenced, or the voices that have often been erased, super important. And being intentional about that. And you don't always have to call out race or ethnicity when you do that. You can just simply say, I'd like to hear some other perspectives. I'd like to hear from you, someone who you may know on a private level has some different experiences, but then you ask them to share some of that in a way that others just see another perspective, as opposed to the Black perspective, which no one person can do that anyway. But hopefully you know what I mean by inviting other perspectives and being intentional about talking about other perspectives.
Right. Well, thank you all so much for joining us for today's episode. I know it was a huge topic to try to cover. You all did a brilliant job. So thank you so much for sharing your experience, your thoughts, your expertise on the matter. For more information on today's guest and today's topic, head over to ArmaniRay.com. And thank you for joining us for Start Now, a podcast to inspire, empower, and educate. We look forward to you joining us next time. And remember, you have to start somewhere and you have to start sometime. So why not start now? Be safe and well.